Hey folks, welcome to the rebroadcast of our CloudFormation and AWS Config demo that we did, I think last week on Twitch. We had a few little technical issues in the Twitch broadcast, and I thought that we would just re-record this and publish it back up to YouTube. So if you remember, if you tuned in, what we wanted to do was just demonstrate how you can use CloudFormation to deploy and set up a simple AWS config deployment. So you can see here I've got our deployment plan laid out. We're going to deploy some resources for IAM, basically a role, a custom role that we're going to use for config. We're going to set up an S3 bucket and configure that bucket with a bucket policy to allow the config service to write data to that bucket, and then we'll actually deploy config. So we'll set up what's called a recorder, a config recorder, and a delivery channel. The delivery channel is what is responsible for deploying or pushing data into that S3 bucket. And then we'll finish the configuration with just a couple simple AWS Managed Config rules where we're going to validate the setup of our S3 buckets in this demo account to make sure that we're prohibiting read and write operations. Okay, so that's pretty much what we're going to do. So let me flip over to... Actually, I'm in PyCharm. So step one is IAM. So let's create a new file here. We'll just call it IAM YAML, and we'll set a description. Okay. So as I mentioned, we need a role that we can use for the config service. Let's flip over to our browser. I've got the role loaded up here in the configuration, or sorry, in the CloudFormation documentation. And what do we need? So obviously we need our assume policy doc, right? What can assume this role? We will set a description even though it's not required. This is just kind of something we do to help us remind ourselves later on what these roles are. We are going to use an Amazon managed policy for this, so we'll assign the ARN for that. I've got that ready to go. We're not going to worry about our session. We're not going to change the path. And we're not going to use permissions boundary. So relatively simple to set up. Let me flip back to PyCharm and we'll get this written out. So the first is a description. Okay, so we'll say custom IAM role used for AWS Config Demo. Okay. Then we need, I'm going to just put a placeholder here now for the policy document. Actually, we'll put in the basic stuff. So we need to set the version. There we go. And then we actually have this statement. And we'll just have a simple statement here. Effect allow. What do we need? We need the service principal, and I've got this already over here. So let me just grab it out of my cheat sheet. So we're going to let the config service assume this role. So we need to define sts assume role. Okay, so that's it for our policy, or sorry, our role, and we are going to use this as input in another template. So let's set up the output now. We'll just call this role 0, value. In this case, we're going to need the ARN, so we have to use the get attribute call, and we'll say role 0.ARN. Man, there we go. And we have to set a name for our export. And if you've watched these videos in the past, I tend just to use stack name, and we'll just call this we'll call this config. It's probably a better name. So that's the first part of our deployment plan, a simple role. So what we're going to do is deploy this, make sure that this works. Flip back to the browser here and go to CloudFormation, create stack. There we go. See if we get the red bar. Okay, we do. So we've got a typo. Oh, I see the typo. I won't switch back. I always forget that it's double colons. end up with a single colon somewhere. So let's try to load this again. There we go. And we'll just call this demo IAM. And again, you know, the importance of tags. So I'm just going to do this once. Normally we would set this up through our deployment process, so we don't have to type all this, but just to demonstrate. All right, so a set of standard tags that we would use. Next, our summary, and we have to acknowledge here that we're creating IAM resources, and we'll click Create Stack. Assume policy document. What did I do wrong there? There must be, oh, assume role policy document. All right. Let's try that again. We'll delete this stack. Look back over to PyCharm, and you can see I put assume policy, so we need that. Okay. Oh, you know what I forgot in here now that I'm thinking about it? We don't have a policy actually assigned to this role. So let's do that down here. Managed policy ARN. And I cut and paste this earlier as well because it's long and I didn't want to have to remember it. So there we go. Okay, so it's actually a good failure because without this, config isn't going to be able to actually do what we want. So let's try back over to the browser here. All right, so that's done. Let's create a new stack. We'll re-upload that IAM template. Hopefully there's no spelling mistakes here. Oh man. I'm having problems with spelling here today. Jeez. Okay, delete that stack again. I'll show you what I did this time. Dropping characters everywhere. Assume role has to be spelt properly in order for this to work. Try this one more time. Demo IAM. Right, we would set our tags here. Do that programmatically is way easier. See if the third or fourth time now, I can't remember, is the charm. Let me move this laptop a bit. A little better. All right, no immediate failures. It's a good sign. I think we're good this time. There we go. Okay, so we should see here in the outputs, there's the Amazon resource name that we'll need later on in the rest of the script or in some of the other templates. So I think we're good. So what's our next step? We're going to actually set up our S3 bucket. Okay. Compared to the other templates here, this template will be kind of the most complex as far as configuration that we have to set up inside this. Okay, so description. I'm going to set a placeholder for parameters. We most likely will have some parameters that we're going to set here. And I'm going to create the different resources. The first thing we're going to do is actually create a KMS key as the default encryption for this bucket. We want to make sure that all of the resources are protected at rest. Okay, so this is pretty simple. AWS key, oh sorry, backwards again, KMS key. And we are going to set a deletion policy. And we'll say retain. So if you haven't seen the deletion policy before, essentially what this allows us to do is override the default operation in CloudFormation. If you delete a stack, then it deletes the resources. You might not want that for certain things, and in this case we want to retain that key after or in the event that the CloudFormation stack for this S3 bucket is deleted. Okay. Just like we've seen, gotta have properties here. There we go. And now we'll set a description. And we'll just say KMS key used for. Okay. We want to enable this key, and we want to enable key rotation. Now, one of the things that is important with keys, or is required with keys, is you must set a key policy. So a key policy is essentially a resource policy. So let me show you what we need to do for that. We'll head back here to our document, and we'll look for KMS. There it is. And we're creating a key. So you can see I've got the description. It's enabled. We're going to enable rotation. So because we're creating our own key here, the KMS service will rotate that key on a yearly basis. And right here is what we're talking about, is the key policy. Okay. Basically decides who or what has access to the key. I did type this out before because I find that this is sometimes challenging. So I'm going to cut and paste the statement, and then we'll walk through it so I can just kind of show you what it's doing. So this is the whole key policy, which all the formatting is messed up on. So let me just check this against what I have in my cheat sheet. Yeah, I don't know why when it cut and pasted. There we go. Okay. Resource. You can see that these are also indented improperly, so let's move that back. And we'll move this back. One more space, actually. So what we have here is a series of statements that control who or what has access to this key. What we've got here at the first is basically the management of the key itself. So in this case, users within this account, and I'm using a pseudo parameter, so we don't have to hard code the account ID, right? The next statement is the service, in this case config, and what can config do. And then we've got at the bottom here again assigning a grant. In this case, the grant is only assignable if it's for an AWS resource. And where we're going to import the value from the export that we set in the IAM template. So we need to set this up here, and we're going to say IAM stack. It's just a string, and its default value is what we called the stack, and we called that demo IAM. Okay. So that's basically how we're referring to the stack, where it will find this export value. Okay, so that's the toughest part here. I like to set up an alias as well for this. So actually, sorry, we're not done here yet, are we? We have to finish the config. Now let me just make sure I'm in the right. That's properties, so we got to go in one space, and we have to define what this key can be used for. So we want it to be used for both encryption and decryption operations, and then tags. And this again, I'm going to cut this or paste this, sorry, from my cheat sheet doc that I've got set up already, and we'll fix the tabs. Okay. So these are the standard set of tags that we would use, and they need values. So we're going to go up here and set the defaults. Okay, so we'll just say let's put this one in quotes just in case it doesn't like the ampersand, and then environment is again a string. The default value, well, I'll set that to development, and we'll add allowed values here to control what somebody can put in this parameter. And when we use allowed values like this, it's going to just provide us with a drop-down. I'll show you that when we get to the deployment. Okay, so that's all we need for the key. And I mentioned earlier on that I like the idea of an alias as an easy way to refer to the key. So let's set up AWS KMS alias. And we're going to use the depends on attribute here because we can't set up the alias unless the key is already set up. Okay. And then we just define the properties. And in this case, it's really simple. Let me show you what we need. We essentially need the name that we want to assign to the alias, and then what is the key that we're going to use. Both of these attributes, I think, are required. We're going to set them up. Okay, so the first is alias name. This has to always start with alias. And then we'll just say AWS Config Demo. And then the next attribute is target key ID, and we're going to refer here to key 0. Okay, so now we've got our key created and the alias to refer to that key. Now we can actually get to setting up the bucket. Okay, so let me go back here. Find S3. And here's the bucket. There are a lot of different attributes that you can set here. We're going to keep this to the bare minimum for what it is that we're trying to create here. Okay, so the type first is AWS S3 bucket, and then we're going to set depends on again because we're going to refer to that key. Essentially, sorry, we're going to refer to the alias. So this will just control, again, the order in which these resources are deployed by CloudFormation. And now we have to define a bunch of properties. Okay. The first is bucket encryption. So this will set up the default encryption. If I flip back to our document, you can see right here bucket encryption, and this is what we're going to create. Okay. So the first attribute is server-side encryption. I'm just going to copy that because I can almost guarantee that I'm going to type that. I have a typo in there. So there's our first step, and now we have to define inside this configuration our rule. Okay, and you can see we've got another level here. Okay, I won't flip back to the browser, I'm just cutting and pasting here, and let's see what's inside our server-side encryption by default. This is where we can refer to the key. Okay. So we've got KMS master key ID, and here we're going to refer to the alias that we created earlier, and then we have to set up the algorithm. There we go. And there's two options here. We can use AES 256 or KMS. So we've got our KMS key, so we'll set that up like this. Okay, so that's our bucket encryption done. The other feature that we want to enable here is lifecycle management, and we would normally put lifecycle management on every bucket that we create. This is a good way. Remember, within S3 there are a series or a bunch of different storage classes that you can use as your data ages over time to help you manage your costs. So in this demonstration, I'll just show you how that works. So here's our lifecycle configuration, and again, I'm just going to copy and paste that because I will type it wrong. And then we've got underneath here, we have to set up the, oops, hang on, that was the wrong item, wasn't it? I wanted lifecycle configuration. This is what I want right here. I cut and paste the wrong item. Okay. And in here we define our rules. Okay. In the rule itself, we have a bunch of things that we can assign. We're going to, again, keep this really simple. You could obviously extend this if you'd like, but we've got rules, and in our case, we're going to set an expiration period. Expiration in days, and we'll just say 365, right? So just expire the objects after a year, and then you have to enable the rule. That's it. Okay? You could obviously do something way more advanced here, but this just demonstrates the flexibility of using something like a lifecycle configuration rule. The other thing that we want to do is ensure that the bucket and the objects within this bucket are they remain private. And the way that we're going to do that, if I flip back to the documentation, is we're going to use an attribute here that says this right here, public access block configuration. So I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to copy that over to PyCharm, and then we'll see what we need to do in the actual definition. And you can see it's just a series of true-false values for the policies and the ACLs that we want to control on this bucket. So I'm going to cut and paste again. And we want to essentially ensure that all of this remains private. So all of the attributes in this configuration are going to be set to true. Right? We want to block public ACLs. We want to block public policies. We also want to ignore public ACLs. And we want to restrict public access. So there's our bucket defined. Okay. We're also going to set up our tags like we did before. So these are the same that we've used in our other demos. So now we've got the bucket tagged, and I set those already. Yeah, so here's the settings for that. So that's our bucket. The other thing that we need is we need a bucket policy, because remember that the only entity that's allowed to write to a bucket when it's created is the owner of the bucket. In this case, we want to provide access to the config service. So we have to define an AWS bucket policy. And this bucket policy depends on that bucket. What did we call it? Bucket 0? Let's make this policy 0 so it jives. Okay, so there we go. And then we can define the properties. So let's have a look in the documentation, the bucket policy. It's relatively painless, right? What is the bucket that you want to assign this policy to? And then what is the policy itself? So our bucket is simply the bucket that we've created in the earlier step. And then the policy, this is where, again, I've created this already. I want to type this in. We're going to create a few statements. And we'll just have to make sure that the spacing is correct. Yeah, spacing looks good. So we'll walk through these. Essentially what we're doing is we're allowing the config service to run the get bucket ACL against our bucket, which we called bucket 0 here. So I have to change these from my cheat sheet. Let's just do that now so I don't forget. Right there. Okay. So if we go through these statements, the first one allows the config service to run the get bucket ACL. Second one allows the config service to run the list bucket. Again, the config service to put an object in a specific prefix within our bucket that we're going to create. And again, you can see we're using here some of the pseudo parameters to make this a little more flexible. And we would do this in all the templates that we make available to our customers in the infrastructure as a infrastructure as code library service that we have. This means that if you were to take this template and deploy it in various accounts, you don't have to change any of these, right? They're set there by default based on the accounts or the regions that you're deploying these different templates within. Okay. So we're allowing the config service to run a put object command against this bucket, but we've also got a condition here where the string, the XAMZ ACL string, must equal bucket owner full control in order for that to work. Okay. And then we want to output this because we're going to need it later on. So bucket 0 equals, in this case, we just want the name of the bucket. And then like we did in our IAM example, we'll use stack name and we'll just call this bucket. So there's the S3 bucket ready to go. Let's try to deploy this and see what happens. So create a stack and upload our S3 template. And we've got an error, okay. Invalid outputs name. Oh, I see it. Spacing issue. So this is essentially creating a new output called export. So I just need to move all of this in a tab to keep it under the bucket definition. Go back to browser and we'll re-upload this file. Okay, and we'll call this, we called the other one Demo IAM, I think. So we'll call this Demo S3. And you can see I've got all my defaults set in my parameters, and we'll just leave that, so we're not going to change anything here. Next. Tags, right? And we'll create the stack. This takes a little bit of time. I find that creating the KMS key takes a little bit of time. The rest of it, as long as the key gets created successfully, should go pretty quickly. So I think what we'll do is we'll let that deploy, and we'll go back to our deployment sheet here and see what the next step is. There we go. Assuming that S3 works okay, I'll keep an eye on that deployment. Then we have to actually set up the AWS Config service. And I mentioned we're going to create a recorder and the delivery channel to push data into that S3 bucket. So let's create that now. We'll just call this config.yaml. There's our new file. And just like we've done in the past, right? Deploy AWS config. We're going to have to pass in a few parameters. I'll come back and fill those in as we define the resources themselves. Let's go back to our browser. You can see that the key is still being created. While we're waiting, we'll go back here and see what we need for the config deployment. Let me just find AWS config here. There it is. Okay. So you can see there's a number of different resources we can define. You know, things like aggregation are for multi-account config deployments. In this case, we're putting everything in a single account. So we're really concerned about the configuration recorder and the delivery channel. So let's start with the recorder. The recorder itself is relatively simple. We need to give it a name. In this case, though, you can see that if we don't name it, the config service will assign a name to it. So that's what we like to do. We'll let it just generate that name dynamically. We do have to set up the recording group. You can see it's not required, but we like to define this to ensure we understand what it is exactly that we are going to capture configuration items and changes for the resources in our account. And this is where the role that we created earlier on comes up. This is required. So really the role is the only required component. Okay. So let's go back to PyCharm. And we'll just call this recorder 0 and define its type. Just grab this from, since I'm challenged with spelling all of these right today, we'll cut and paste. Okay. Name we're not going to define. We are going to define the recording group. So let's go back over to the browser and see what we have to define. Okay, so the recording group isn't really that complicated. What devices or what items are we going to capture? So this is a Boolean statement. We want to capture all supported resources, include the global resource types, and then if you needed something specific, you could define a list of strings for the resource types. We're going to keep this simple. The first thing is all supported, and we're going to set that to true, and then include global resource types. We're also going to say true. So if you were deploying, remember that config is a regional service. So if you had a single AWS account and we're using multiple regions, then at a minimum you should really be deploying config in every one of those regions. However, you you wouldn't want to capture global resources from every region. So what we would normally do is the customer would provide us with their primary region, let's say CA Central 1, but they're also using, let's say, US West 2 as a backup region, like a disaster recovery region. So when we were to deploy this, we would say the recorder in CA Central 1 grabs all the global resources. The recorder in, what did I say, US West 1, we would define this as no because we're capturing those resources from the CA Central deployment. Okay, so that's all we need in the, we need the role ARN too, don't we, right? Role ARN, and I've got this typed out already because this one's a tough one to remember. This goes back again to that IAM stack that we created earlier. So I'm going to set up my parameter, and we're going to say IAM stack. It's a string type, and its default is what we called that stack. Okay, so speaking of that, let's just check to see how our S3 bucket is going. Oh, we actually got an error, so let's see what we've got here. See, I'm having problems with typing today. Okay, so let's delete this stack. It's just a typo again when we defined or when we referred to the master key. So let's delete the stack. This is another great example of why it's important to have all of these CloudFormation templates in a centralized repository. You know, normally when we're creating these for customers or adding them to our infrastructure as code library, we would do all this testing in our what we call our support account, validate everything and make them available to our customers so you wouldn't run into these problems. Okay. But what you're seeing here is the process that we would go through if we were creating something custom for a customer or if we were adding or updating a library, or sorry, a template in our library. So let's go back to S3, and it's back up here. I want to say that this is actually like that, but let me just check in the docs. Like I said, this takes a little bit of time to deploy with the key, so I want to make sure that we fix it this time. So let me go back here, the browser back, and this is in bucket encryption. In our rule, our default, yeah, uppercase. So I'm actually going to do the same thing. Now I'm a little gun shy. Let's grab that, and I'll just dump it back in the template. Yeah, I think I got it that time. So we'll go back to CloudFormation, and we'll say create stack. We'll upload that S3 template again, and we'll call it Demo S3. Everything else should be ready to go. And we're going to next, and then create the stack. All right, so we'll do the same thing. We'll let that go. We'll flip back to PyCharm, and we'll have a look at, we were working on the config. So we've got the IAM stack, and we refer here to the Amazon resource name of the role that we want to assign to the recorder. So that's the first component. The other component that we need is the delivery channel. So we're going to call this delivery 0. Its type is AWS Config delivery channel. I'll verify that in a second. And then we're going to say properties. See, I can't even type properties anymore. Let's have a look in the docs what we need for the delivery channel. Config's up near the top here. There's our recorder. Here's our delivery channel. So this is also relatively simple. We need to define the properties of our delivery, okay, how often we want to do it, the bucket name, prefix. You can also integrate this with the simple notification service. We're not going to do that today. I do find that you have to be careful when you do integration with config and SNS. You could end up generating a lot of notifications. So just be careful when you define that if you want to go down that path. Okay. So I'm going to grab this because that's the first thing we're going to need here in our properties definition. And then the delivery properties is nothing more than, let me get back to the browser, how often we want this snapshot or the delivery channel to push data to that S3 bucket. And you can see we've got a number of options. The minimum here would be every 24 hours. We're going to set this just to every hour. Okay. So that's 1 hour. And then we need the name of the bucket that we want to refer to. And like I did before, actually I can grab this right from here. Okay. This is the S3 stack, which we'll define up here. Is demo S3. Speaking of which, let's go back to CloudFormation and see if we fixed up all the typos. Okay, so the key is done. The alias should happen pretty quickly, and we'll see if we fix that typo in, what was it? The key, KMS master key ID in a second. So we're making progress there. And in here we've got demo S3, and I can't remember what we called the output already. I want to say just bucket, but let's have a look. Yeah, we just called it bucket. So we need to change in the config here. That's bucket. So those are the only two options that we need for config. So essentially we're in a holding pattern now until this completes. All right, so there, we're through KMS. All right, I think what we'll do is as we're waiting, we'll get to the last component. Go back to our deployment plan. Now config out of the box is going to discover resources in your account as they're created, and it's going to record configuration changes on those configuration items from the moment they're discovered until the moment you delete them, which is great, right? It gives you a nice picture of what's in your account and what's changing and who's changing it. So that's fantastic for audit and troubleshooting. But I think one of the biggest benefits of config is that it allows us to use configuration rules. And a configuration rule is really just a compliance rule that you can define, right? Are our resources of type X following rule Y? And essentially, the output of a managed config rule is really true or false. It's either compliant or it's not compliant. In our example, we're going to deploy a couple AWS managed config rules just to validate the configuration of our S3 bucket. And one thing that I would say about config rules is there's a huge list of Amazon provided config rules. Always start there first. There's no reason for you to create something from scratch if the folks at Amazon have built that for us already, right? Leverage those tools where it makes sense so you can deploy your solutions faster. Having said that, if you have specific business rules, AWS most likely won't be able to cover those, and that's where you could create your own customer managed config rules that allow you to kind of build in or extend the functionality of config to monitor for compliance for specific situations. Okay, so let's create, we'll just call it rule.yaml, and just like we've done in the previous templates, we'll just say deploy AWS config rules for demo. Okay. I can't remember if we need parameters here, so we're going to define, we'll do the placeholder thing that I normally do, and then we're going to define our rules. So let's go back and see, we'll check our config, our S3 bucket deployment, and we got another error. Look at this. I'm really having problems typing today. We're going to come back to that. Actually, I'm going to delete it. So that's in our policy definition now. We've got, again, a typo in the resource section. So we'll delete that because we've got to fix it. And then what we want to do is we want to go here and have a look for AWS config rules. And here it is. Okay. Again, the definition of a config rule is relatively simple. We need to give it a name. Okay. If you don't provide your own name, Amazon CloudFormation or AWS CloudFormation will create one for you. And again, that's the way that we would normally deploy this. Gives us, I think, more flexibility. Describe the rule. We would always try to describe that rule because very quickly after deploying these rules, you might forget what they're for. If the rule requires input parameters, you can define those. Not all rules do. Define the execution frequency, like is it every hour, periodic, or are you looking at changes in the environment to invoke this rule? The scope, so which resources within your accounts are you going to assign this config rule 2, and then the source. In our case, the source will be actually a unique identifier for the AWS Managed Rule. Okay. Now, because we're still having problems with S3, let's find that S3 policy again. So here's our bucket policy. And see what I did? I put policy instead of policy document. So lots of kind of trivial, I cannot say that today, errors to deal with. So we're going to find the bucket, we're going to define the bucket policy right here. And this should be policy document. All right. Seems today that we're going to deploy almost every template 3 times. I hope we do better in the end. Create. Upload our S3 template and call it Demo S3. All the parameters are set, right? And then create stack. All right, so again, we'll wait for that. And in the meantime, we're going to go back to PyCharm and we'll work ahead a couple steps here and find, where's my deployment rule? Oh, here. Right here. Okay, so our first rule, if you look back here, we want to create 2. One to ensure that writes are prohibited, and one to ensure that reads are prohibited. So our first rule, we're going to define its type. Okay, and it's a config rule. Let me pull up the documentation again because I'm going to cut and paste a lot of this so that I hope we can avoid some typos like I've been doing today. Config rule. All right. And then we have to define the properties. As we mentioned, we're going to let CloudFormation assign the rule name. We're going to set up a description here. Validate S3 buckets are in compliance. The next thing we need is input parameters. Remember, those are optional. I know from looking at these rules, we don't need input parameters in this case, so we can skip over that. So we're going to set, actually I'm going to cut and paste this, the maximum execution frequency. So let me just grab that out of the doc and we'll dump it here. Okay. And for demo purposes, we're going to say execute that every hour. And then we have to define the scope. Okay. The scope actually has, let me flick back and show you this. The scope has a couple requirements. The resource IDs, you can assign specific types, and then you can look for tag key values, key names and key values. In our case, we're simply going to assign this to the resource types. And I'm going to cut and paste. There's our compliance type. And in this case, we know that we want to look at the buckets that are in our account. And the source of this is an AWS Managed Rule. And when you use an AWS Managed Rule, you have to identify the source. And I've got this written down already. I'll show you where to find this once we get this deployment going. So there's our first rule. Okay. Ensuring that the S3 buckets have public rights prohibited. Let's go back and see where we are in our S3 bucket, because that's going to hold us up here if I can't get that right. Okay, through the key, it's creating the alias. So yeah, like I said, it takes a little bit of time. While we're waiting, let's create our second rule. And the second rule is going to look just like the first one. So we're just going to cut and paste. Okay, change its logical name. We'll leave this, we'll leave this, we'll leave this. And the thing that we need here is, again, the unique identifier for this rule is the public read prohibited rule. So now we've got everything built. We've got IAM, which is successful. We've got S3, which we're trying to get to go. Once S3 is set up, then we can do the config setup as well as the rule deployment. So let me flip back to the browser. We're really kind of in a holding pattern at this point and see what we got here. There we go. Third time is the charm. So now we've got our S3 bucket. Let's deploy config. can see we're passing in the stack name for IAM and S3. Tag best practice. Next. Create stack. Now, again, assuming that I don't have all sorts of typo issues today, this should happen pretty quickly. There we go. I think that's supposed to be uppercase. Let's have a quick look. So this was in our configuration recorder, and you'll notice right away, uppercase. Man. Okay, the rollback's complete. Delete. Delete. Go back to PyCharm and find that setup. So right here, roll ARN like that. Back to the browser, see if this delete is done. Go. And we'll try this again. The good thing is that if we can figure out these typos that I've been making, the config deployment as well as the rule deployment is relatively quick, so we shouldn't take too long to do this. Let me just adjust this mic. And create. So there's our delivery channel and our recorder. The delivery channel's done. The recorder's done. Config is done. All right. Before we go have a look at the config console, though, let's deploy our rule. Template parameters must be a map. Normally that's when I cut and paste something and I just have the tabs wrong. So let's see here. Oh, I left parameters in thinking we needed that. We don't need that. And let's re-upload the rule template. Okay, we made it past there. Now we'll call this demo rule. And create stack. Let's see what happens. There we go. Actually, outside of that simple typo, that was an easy one. All right, so we've got our IAM role configured. We've got an S3 bucket configured and secured. We've got config deployed, and now we've got a series of rules. So let's go over to the config console. And see what we have. There we go. Okay. Oh, we've got another rule in here that's looking at something. So we didn't enable versioning on this S3 bucket, so that makes sense. But if we look at the specific rules that we deployed, demo rule 0, demo rule 1, both of those are compliant. And we can drill down here and see some more information about these resources. Obviously, nothing is non-compliant, so if we flip over to there, there's our buckets. Okay. The CF template bucket is what's created because we're deploying this through the management console. So basically a holding zone for the templates. So there you have it, folks. Let me just flip back to, before we wrap up, we'll flip back to our deployment plan. We've got our resources deployed through IAM, basically a custom role that's going to be used. We deployed our S3 bucket, configured that bucket, controlled access to that bucket, ensured that that bucket was not made public by using the policy configuration. We created within the config deployment a recorder and delivery channel, and then we deployed a couple simple AWS Managed Config rules. Right? Did it all programmatically through CloudFormation. So what we could do now is we've got these templates created. You could deploy these rule or these config setup across multiple accounts if you needed to. Okay? So there you go. Thanks again for watching the re-recording of our Twitch broadcast. I appreciate coming back, and sorry about the original little technical issues that we had there last week. We'll be back, I guess, tomorrow, Tuesday, and do another CloudFormation demo. So thanks, everybody. Take care.